I mean, it's going to make the U.S. look more like an emerging market than a developed market in terms of volatility. And everyone who gives lip service to the sustainability agenda, no one actually talks about that, which is quite interesting. It just shows you how coward everybody is.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode in the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring someone on who knows a lot about ESG, which you may not have heard about, but you'll know a lot more about it today. In investing, the climate change hoax, the green energy agenda, and so much more. And it's none other than Paul Tice. Paul, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Hey, Vance. Good to be with you.
Hey, it's a really pleasure to have you on. We've got a lot to talk about, including your recent book, The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System. There's a lot of good information in there that the audience will want to read. I'll make sure to put that in the show notes page, link to that. But before we get going too far, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience, then we'll jump right into it. So Paul Tice is an Adjunct Professor of Finance at the Leonard N School of Business at New York University, where he teaches mainly on the energy, infrastructure, and project finance markets. He also regularly contributes op-ed pieces on energy and finance-related topics to the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, and other news media, and is author of this book, The Race to Zero. Mr. Tice earned a BA degree in English, magna cum laude, from Columbia University in 1983, and an MBA degree in finance from the Leonard N. Stern School of Business at New York University in 1988. He is a member of Phi Beta Kappa. So, with all that stuff going on, Paul, why do you do what you do every day?
Well, I mean, at this point in my career, and I ended working on Wall Street back in 2022. And the first thing I did was write the book because I thought ESG is something that needs to be focused on by the public, more particularly going forward, because it is a real threat to the economy, whether you're invested in the market. But at this point in my life, I'm now in my 60s. I wanted to focus on something more consequential. And I think what's happening in this country with regard to energy policy and the climate agenda, and ESG is a very big part of that. My day-to-day now, I'm self-employed. I can write and say what I want, which is very liberating. It's becoming increasingly a problem if you work on Wall Street and really in any industry. And so that freedom feels good. But, I think over the next 10 years, it's going to be interesting times, in this country, in terms of the direction of energy and economic policy, particularly depending on the outcome of the election this November.
Yeah, and we're heating up into the election season, so we'll make sure that we mention some of that here today. What got you so interested in energy? I mean, I know that it's a master resource, and there's so much other things that could go into. But given your background and your knowledge, what really got you so interested in energy?
Well, I started out in Wall Street after I got my MBA in fixed income research, so on the capital markets side, and I covered a number of sectors, initially. But then I picked up energy when there was an opening, and analysts left in the mid '90s. And I've been involved with energy for the last 30 years now, first in sell-side research, and then over the second half of my career as an investor. And I've looked at energy from investment grade to high yield, emerging markets, and also, public and private credit and on the equity side as well. So I think I've looked at the full spectrum of energy, and that's given me a good background because over the last 10 years, that ESG and sustainability has really come on strong on Wall Street since the crisis, and those two are interrelated. Energy obviously is the one industry that's in the direct sights of the ESG movement, right? Defunding oil and gas is the unspoken objective of ESG. So it gave me a front row seat, if you will, to what was going on with ESG. And my last job on Wall Street was with a European asset management firm, and that actually is ground zero when it comes to sustainability because Europe is obviously leading the charge on climate, sustainable finance, and ESG. So it was very eye-opening. So energy has worked out well. And again, I've taken that knowledge base now, and I'm trying to, parlay that, adding to my resume that you went through there. Earlier this year, I joined the National Center for Energy Analytics, which is a new energy think tank run by Mark Mills, formerly of the Manhattan Institute. And our mission statement is to basically provide objective research that hopefully backs up sound energy policy, which is obviously the driver of good economic policy. So it's going to allow me basically to focus on what I love, which is talking about the energy sector now on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And that group, is it still affiliated with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, or is that separate?
Yeah, no, we're the sponsor of National Center for Energy Analytics is the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So,
okay.
And then the NCEA, we're based out of Washington.
Got it. I thought so. I worked at TPPF for about a decade off and on. I was the chief economist there for a while. And so a great group, a lot of good people that are there. So that's good to hear so much of that's going on. And you're right. Energy it's just so interconnected with everything that we do every day. My background, whenever I got my PhD in economics at Texas Tech University, my dissertation was actually on, the title of it was the macroeconomic effects of oil price shocks, and petroleum prices. And so I looked at oil price shocks and because energy really interested me a lot, just the influence that it has on our lives every day, but also the macroeconomy and the geopolitical economy. And there's so much more that's going into that. And now with all this ESG issues or environmental, social justice and governance sort of issues, it's expanded so much into certain areas that it's really frightening, Paul, to think about the direction of where things are going. And so I'm so glad that you wrote this book. There's so much information that's in there. Part of it, I think it's just an easy read overall. You got a lot of great information, so I really appreciate that, and I want to dive into that. Before we do that, real quick though, what's kind of your worldview? Mine's more of a classical liberal, lowercase libertarian, if you will, in a lot of ways, fiscal conservative. But I wonder where was your worldview kind of going into this?
Well, I got my MBA when Milton Friedman wasn't kind of a curse word when it comes to curriculum. So
yeah.
I would say that I'm old school. More traditional approach. I think we need smaller government. We need to give the balance of freedoms back to individuals. And, there's a reason why ESG is, a government sponsored agenda. We need to acknowledge that first, and why it targets fossil fuels, because fossil fuels drives economic growth, it drives living standards, but it also drives democracy and individual freedoms, personal mobility, right? Choice for the consumer. And so there's a reason why we're so focused on shutting down fossil fuels using this contrived problem of carbon pollution, which it is. And we need more people to speak that out loud and not be afraid to say so. But if they can control fossil fuels because of, the theoretical impact to the environment, then they control every transaction for every individual. So it's all about political power and control over the individual. And the other side's been at this for 40 years. I mean, this is not a fad that hit Wall Street suddenly over the last 10 years that we never knew about before as a way to make money. It's not a way to make money. There's no proof that's the case. But it's it's really the last leg of the stool going back to at least the 80s and arguably back to the 60s. And actually, we can take this back 200 years if you want to view ESG and stakeholder capitalism as basically, the logical conclusion of Marxism going back to the 19th century. And I argue that in the book. But we need to be aware about what the end game is here. The other side is not going to acknowledge any problems with the theory or the execution. And there's a reason for that, because the ends are basically political.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you do a great job, too, of talking about like where it comes from. A lot of these global governing entities where it's kind of trickled down here more recently into these larger government problems and their quote unquote solutions to those problems. One other question that I have for you, Paul, before we get into all this is that, it's been a few years ago now, but when I first started hearing about ESG, and one of our friends, Jason Isaac, used to talk to me a lot about it when I was at TPPF, and he was really getting on this. And, and you talked about Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is my favorite economist. I got one of his books over here. Whenever I started first hearing about it, there was a big push against it. And just to lay my cards on the table, I was like, I don't know if this is a role for government. I don't know if the government should be getting involved in this and what this would mean for the marketplace and everything else. And so I was concerned about it. But the thing that got to me was whenever they started using taxpayer money through public pensions and all these other things to infiltrate the state's economy, in Texas where I live or in other places. And I started to see this in a whole different perspective where it's like, no, it's not the government coming in on the marketplace. It's that this is also taxpayer dollars that are being used for these nonsensical pushes of ESG. I wonder from your more classical liberal or old school, I like the way you put that old school view. What was your initial thinking about this? Were you ever on that path kind of like I was, or did you always see this of the huge cost that it was?
No, I mean, I think, when this really started to gain ground, and I worked at BlackRock for 6 years.
Okay.
I've been gone, for 9 now. And, I left in 2015, and that's when sustainability was still kind of coming together at that point. But it really was, really not a thing, even at BlackRock up until the signing of the Paris Agreement. And I think that was an inflection point for a lot of these movements where we've now accelerated. And that clearly has been the case in ESG. But, I think it's been obvious what it's been intended to do. It's interesting talking to a number of different colleagues at different firms. People won't acknowledge what the end goal is, right? And I clearly am opposed to it. And I'm defending the oil and gas sector because I'm an investor and a research analyst covering it. And so I'm just stating the objective reality is that you're trying to shut down fossil fuels, right? And so even the people in Wall Street, I think, are not even aware, and they're missing the forest for the trees here about what the end game is here. I mean, if you're asking for carbon emissions disclosure, there's a reason for that. I mean, as soon as you get, how big your carbon footprint is, you're not going to use that to make an investment decision. You're going to go straight back to whatever company it is, and if his footprint is too big, or his or her footprint is too big, then you are going to tell them they need to change their behavior. So it's not like standard investment analysis. And I think a lot of the people on Wall Street over the last 10 years, which has been an abnormal investing environment, post-crisis. So there's that driver. They haven't realized what's been going on. And now it's becoming clearly and apparent, and it will increasingly so between now and 2030, because 2030 is a real deadline for the other side. I mean, we can laugh off all of the threats and the warnings about the world ending in 2000 and 2014 and 15 every few years, right? But they're still focused on their agenda. And that's going to include a lot of economic pain in this country, particularly in Europe, because if they come even close to hitting their emissions targets, it's going to lead to deindustrialization and, lower living standards.
Yeah. It's a mess. It really is scary. I mean, thinking about your book and you in there talking about 2030, right? And what's going to happen in 2030. And you even talk about, the 2030 exit plan. How do we get out all of this? But maybe we should start from the beginning though, of why, is climate change really an issue that we need to be concerned about? Because so many, and you brought it up earlier, is carbon emissions a pollutant or not? And we're breathing it out right now. So we've got some other issues going on there. But I think you do a great job in the book. Or I know you do a great job in the book of explaining this. But how do you like to explain what's going on with climate change? Because I think you're right. That's exactly where all this gets started with quote unquote sustainability through ESG. I'd love to hear your perspective though.
Sure. Yeah. So just to state an important fact around sustainability, the priority goal of both of those movements is climate change, right?
Yeah.
And it's being led by the United Nations, and it has been since the 1980s. So in the 1980s, you had sustainable development as a concept that came out of the United Nations, right? And then climate change, that government agenda was taken over by the UN. And you had the IPCC and the framework conventions. Now we meet every year to talk about it. So they've been leading both of those verticals, sustainable development, climate change. They are also the leader of ESG. They set up their own investor advocacy group back in 2006, right? And every Wall Street firm right now is a member of that organization, and no one is able to leave. because obviously everyone joined to signal their virtue, right? And, that makes it very tough to find the exit, right?
Yeah.
And now the problem is that regulations are coming in Europe, here in the US, led by the SEC, and that's going to make all of this mandatory. So basically, Wall Street's been suckered into this trade initially by being told it was, it's optional, it's bespoke, you can do it whatever you want. And now it's becoming more prescriptive, and that'll be mandatory. And they're going to tell you that you need to focus first on climate change. So ESG is basically the funding mechanism for climate change and sustainable development. And why is that perfectly logical in the grand scheme of things? Because of all the capital in the private sector markets, right? I mean, the average turnover for equity is like $1 trillion a day. Similar for fixed income, right? So government working through activists initially and now more directly through regulators want to control that flow of capital. So we're going to direct that away from oil and gas, and we're going to direct it towards clean energy, first and foremost. The rest of the agenda, which is secondary, they're going to figure that out down the road, right? That's why I think a lot of these diversity and other issues are more of a distraction. And I make that point in the book. We have to really focus on climate change and what's going on in the financial markets right now, because that's going to be what causes the most economic pain. So, but there's a logic and a method to their madness here. I mean, if they relied on charity in the U.S., I think it's like $500-600 billion a year that's given to charity. That's the daily turnover, and not even in the markets. So they really want to gain control and impose this gatekeeper function on the markets, right? About carbon emissions is going to be the determinant for whether you allocate capital to one company or not, right? And that's already happening in the banking market, right? You're seeing a lot of banks, including European banks that used to have an energy presence here in the U.S., like Barclays, are now backing away under pressure, right? And that's another design feature of ESG. Everybody's under pressure, right? It's a pressurized system like a natural gas pipeline, right? And that's how it works, because if you stick your head up and complain, you become the next target. So Wall Street firms are first pressured to engage with their companies that they invest in, right? And then the companies are pressured by Wall Street invest. So everyone is kept in line. And that's one reason why no one's spoken out, right? I can tell you personally, if you work in the industry, you can't speak out, or you'll be out of a job and not get paid, or probably both, right? And it's the same if you work for, say, Disney or Bud Light, right? So it's a very totalitarian system. We need to acknowledge that and coming up with ways to kind of free everybody to get out from under it and to speak more freely.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of the next step with that, we have all these people that are out there pushing these agendas. We have the government coming through. And Paul, a lot of this from the federal government, like you said, the SEC, there are other organizations or other agencies that are pushing a lot of this down as well. The FDIC have some of this. The the Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB.
Right. Department of Labor too.
Yeah, Department of Labor. I mean, you kind of go through the list of different ones. But a lot of this is just through rulemaking, right? It's through the executive branch. It's not really even through a lot of laws from Congress. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, part of this, I think that's also a design feature of progressive.
Yeah.
We're not going to win at the ballot box. So we're going to impose our agenda through the courts, right? Or through regulatory agencies. So it's a non-democratic means, and that clearly is what they're using for ESG. So now, and Europe's leading the charge here, and the U.S. is playing catch-up under the Biden administration because we had a 4-year pause under Trump. I would argue you should have done more to push back on the other side and reclaim ground, and hopefully that happens if there is a second Trump term. But clearly under the Biden administration, from day one, they have been focused on climate. And that includes ESG. And they set up within a month of the inauguration, they set up a new task force within the SEC, the Climate and ESG Task Force. And then they spent 3 years going after Wall Street firms and fining them for alleged problems of greenwashing, right? Which I think was just to kind of lay the predicate for the need for more rules. And then they followed that up with climate disclosure rules, right? And we actually, at the NCEA, we have a paper coming out right after Labor Day that talks about the SEC climate disclosure rules, what their real intent is, and how negative they're going to be for the markets. Decarbonization, we all talk about that, or the other side talks about it in rosy terms. But when you think through exactly what that means for the economy, the read-through for the financial markets is going to be particularly negative, right? I mean, it's going to make the U.S. look more like an emerging market than a developed market in terms of volatility. And everyone who, gives lip service to the sustainability agenda, no one actually talks about that, which is quite interesting. It just shows you how coward everybody is.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Man, I'm getting fired up about it. So this is an important issue that for the audience, for them to understand, because a lot of them may not have heard of ESG, but it's something that we're all hearing more about now. The financial industry is hearing a lot about it. There are public pensions that have been investing in ESG, not even just investing, but of using it as the overall way to diversify their portfolio more into these ESG, environmental, renewable energy sort of approaches, and against fossil fuels and any sort of businesses that are dealing with fossil fuels for a long time. You have states like Oklahoma, Texas, where I'm at, and some others that have banned this idea or banned this push on, especially on public pensions, from using taxpayer money to go against fossil fuels, and other things too, like Second Amendment rights and other things, because of this huge push from this top-down, starts, like you said earlier, United Nations, the federal government. Now a lot of the states are being infiltrated as well from this. And so we're seeing this push across the states, which I think the states will be an important part of this, right? In their system of federalism, laboratory of competition, let's see what works. But since the federal government is the one that's pushing a lot of this criteria and regulations, the states have to be the place to push back. But Paul, at the same time, we're seeing pushback from the courts that we have in Oklahoma, for example. Texas, not yet, but there's been a lot of court cases already moving in this direction to try to stop these pieces of legislation from passing. I've written some articles with and you have too, on what's going on in Oklahoma and also in Texas. But what are some of these issues in the states that we really got to make sure that we're concerned about and keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the red states, and we should step back and say ESG is a political issue, right? Mm-hmm. Let's just acknowledge that. It's progressive politics. It's masquerading as finance. The only way to talk about it is in political terms. And there's a reason why the Democratic side uniformly supports it and Republicans don't.
Yeah. Yep.
My Marco Rubio water drink.
Hey, do it.
So, I think we need to acknowledge that. And there's a reason why red states are leading the charge, and that's all to the good, right? So they've challenged most of these rules that we discussed a minute ago from the SEC, the Department of Labor, and that needs to continue, right? Especially if we get 4 more years of a Democratic administration, right? Yeah. So the red states have standing. A lot of the attorney generals have been very good. Some of them have also been suing some of the leaders on Wall Street, like BlackRock, bringing cases, which Tennessee has done, right? So I think all of this is to the good because we need to roll back these regulations, right? Once it becomes mandatory, then it doesn't really matter if you are a true believer or not. I think there are many more non-believers who are just afraid and they're just going along to get along. And, they're waiting to see how these regulations come down and whether they actually pass a lot of these court challenges. So that's critical. And I think all the red states, Texas and Oklahoma in particular, need to continue to lead that charge. But some of these rules that have been passed, which are, again, perfectly consistent with the right of every state to control their dollars, right? So if we're telling consumers, you shouldn't patronize a company like Disney or Target or Bud Light because you're not happy with their political stance or their stance on certain social issues, that is perfectly consistent to say at the state level, you should not give your financing dollar to firms that are, using their capital that they manage to push through, an agenda, an anti-fossil fuel agenda. And again, we need to acknowledge that up front. Yeah. That is the goal of what ESG is. It's not to get down carbon intensity, whatever that is, right? It's to take down carbon emissions. And the only way that you do that, if you're the oil and gas industry, is by stopping operations, right? Maybe you go into something green, which you have no expertise in, so it's not exactly going to improve you as a fundamental story. But they want to shut down fossil fuel production in this country, right? In all the developed markets, for that matter. So I think we need to acknowledge that end game. But with some of these anti-ESG laws, it's, again, they have had no impact. So it's been very interesting to see the other side respond and try and manufacture a case that they're hurting state taxpayers or state pensioners, right? So Oklahoma, which I focused on initially, wrote something earlier this year, and Texas would be the two leading ones. And this is a design feature with all the ESG research, right? They've used, a reams. It's just like the climate model where they just churn out a lot of these research papers and quotes to justify the conclusion, right? Which is that climate change is an existential threat. They're using the same approach with ESG to try and prove that, oh yes, it does lead to financial outperformance and investment outperformance, but they're all basically the same type of approach where it's a metadata or meta-metadata. So you're looking at raw data from 10,000 feet, and you can never actually see what the true picture is, right? And it's the same approach with some of these anti-ESG studies, and a number of them have been sponsored by environmental groups, right? So that should be like your initial red flag. A group like the Sunrise Group, which has been, publicly protesting about climate change and fossil fuels, all of a sudden is concerned with municipal finance in Texas, right? I mean, call me crazy. I think that's contrived, right?
Yeah.
And then it doesn't take that long to find an academic, because of how liberal all the universities are, including the business schools, including my business school, I would say, to come up with a conclusion-driven piece of research. And they use regression analysis. You can't see exactly what's going on. But in both cases with Oklahoma and Texas, if you work in the market, I mean, all you need to do is just look at the data about what's been happening for municipal yields in both states. And away from interest rates going up because we went into a Fed tightening cycle in 22, there's been no discernible impact on average yield, so average borrowing costs for either of those two anti-ESG states, right? And, if you look at some of the other arguments that they made, well, you can't see it in yields, but their underwriting commission that they're paying is significantly higher. They goosed and played around with that data and manipulated it in the case of Texas. But the macro data for the municipal market tells the opposite story. I mean, it shows that it's highly competitive. Underwriting spreads have been compressing for the last 20 years, and they're not doing anything different for Texas, which is a AAA state, or for Oklahoma, which is a AA state. So these are two of the highest rated states with energy economies, and energy's been doing very well the last 3 years, right? Prices have moved up by 50%. The industry is in a much more stable place, even with capital discipline. So the fundamentals are very solid. So everything that they're trying to argue clearly contradicts what you see with your eyes, right? So, and they use the same type of false logic to argue that we're hurting state pension plans by not allowing them to give their money to BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street or whatever the ESG focused investment management firm is, right? And they throw out these big numbers that look scary. But when you consider in the case of Oklahoma, $10 million of breakage fees to take your business from BlackRock to somebody else for a portfolio that's $9 billion is a rounding error, right? And the one study that they used to kind of support the anti-ESG argument in Oklahoma, which again was flawed throughout it, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that, in 2022, the markets were down 15 to 20%, fixed income equity, right? So all of these portfolios lost billions of dollars, right? Capital losses, but still losses nonetheless. So they're arguing about $10 million of one-time breakage fees as if it's catastrophic, right? And I'm sure the administrative overhead for all these state pension funds is pretty fat to begin with.
Yeah.
So, if they're concerned about that, they should really be addressing, other areas. But again, whenever you see progressives arguing about wasting taxpayer dollars, you're on to the right thing, right?
Yeah, well put. Well put. Yeah, it's extraordinary too, because they're trying to get more clever on how they model these things, so that way they can hide from you what the reality is on the ground. And one of the things that I think you bring up really well in your paper or in your book, The Race to Zero, and in your other works, and in the research that I did here recently as well on these, is you've got to look at the fiduciary duty. And the fiduciary duty of these public pension managers, or those of the local bonds or whatever they are, should be about getting the best returns for the taxpayer. And so in my view, look, the government doesn't have any money. It's the taxpayers' money. So we shouldn't maybe not even get into any of these investments to begin with, but they are. So let's make sure that it's as broad-based as possible, because not only were they going in this direction of ESG, and in a cycle with which we had higher interest rates moving up, and one of the studies tried to correct for, or adjust for, or control for, I should say, the federal funds rate increasing over time. But that's not the only rate that will influence the overall marketplace. 10-year rates and other rates, and just the way that it was controlled for, I don't think was quite right to begin with. So there was more of a correlation versus causation sort of issue, and other problems that were going on. But the other issue with this, Paul, is that Texas and Oklahoma are also highly dependent, not totally dependent, but highly dependent on oil and gas activity. If you are moving funds away from fossil fuels and moving it to renewable or other types of energy sources, you're hurting the state. You're hurting the economic output, the job creation, and everything else. And so it's not like it's all in just one basket and everything else is held constant. You're actually hurting the economy at the same time. Don't you think?
I mean, that's why it's perfectly, fair for these states to basically to ban banks that have those policies in place, or to not give money to investment managers because you're worried that they're going to take your capital and use that to leverage against the oil and gas industries that your state depends on, right? And that's the problem with with ESG. They may say that, if you just look at the number of and the amount of sustainable funds that have been raised, it's fairly small, right? Even at BlackRock, it is 6% of their total AUM, right? Which may surprise some people given how much they talk about ESG every day, right? So targeted sustainable funds are fairly small, but the real risk is that ESG is being integrated into every fund. And that's a mandate of the UN group, the Principles for Responsible Investment. You're required to do that as a member of that group. You have to integrate it into every fund, whether, you raise that fund initially talking about sustainability or not. That's a huge fiduciary problem. I think that's the key fiduciary problem here, on top of the fact that ESG does not lead to outperformance, right? None of the studies done by academics or anybody else has yet proven that following the sustainable agenda will lead to better company performance and better portfolio performance. Every one of those white papers or academic research ends the same way. Well, we think we see something. We're not quite sure what it is, but we have to keep on looking, right? So it's kind of like Bigfoot, right? We just need better data, right? Well, we had better data, then we could see what's really happening. But the other point about some of the research that's been used to prove it just shows you how ridiculous the other side is. They've gone back to 1970, right? And they've looked at studies of studies, right? So again, you're 10,000 feet. And they've made the case that they can see patterns there that proves that ESG leads to outperformance. Having worked in the market since the 1980s, right? I will tell you, no one ever talked about ESG, sustainability, even social impact during the 80s, 90s, 2000s, right? So what these papers are arguing is that it was happening. Nobody in the market was talking about it or aware of it, but it was leading to outperformance. And no one really knew about it until now, 15 years hence, right? So it's a crazy argument that they're trying to make. And if they can't prove that it leads to outperformance, we shouldn't be doing any of this. Just like with climate change, if there is not a climate problem and we don't have a good handle on the data, we can't really measure it even now. There's no historical data that's consistent. And there's a very strong argument based on what we do know that temperature leads CO2, not the other way around. In which case we should be pencils down on all of this, right? Mm-hmm. And I think more people need, including the energy industry, which knows a lot about climate science, right, that they're afraid to talk about. We need to start speaking some of these truths out loud.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Amen. I mean, look, for what I can tell, the climate is always changing. And it has always changed. I mean, it's a natural sort of change as that goes along. The more we head more in this direction from a government top-down approach, which is socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, the worse we're going to be able to deal with climate change. You know, and so I see it as it's actually counterproductive to the ability for us to prosper, to flourish, and have more resources and abundance and everything else, however you want to say it. I think this is actually very counter to what we're trying to do from the approach that they're making. And how can we, you know, as we're closing up here some now, how can we really start to push back? I mean, we have an election coming up. That's one thing. But a lot of it's going to be done on the regulatory side. And so, I mean, if it's a Trump executive branch, which I was a part of for a year in the Trump's Office of Management and Budget, a chief economist, I worked a lot with OIRA and others on regulatory things. And I think you're right. There's probably more that we should have done at that time that we didn't do. We did do a lot of other deregulation, but maybe not as much as in that particular area.
A lot of different fronts during the administration.
Well, that's true too. That's true, man. But you know, if it is a Harris sort of administration, we're going to be dealing with this crap even more. And so I wonder kind of where your mindset is about where we should be heading and how do we really deal with this?
And I do think, and I've written this, I think if there is a Harris administration, then climate is going to be ratcheted up. And so a lot of what you've seen in the first, you know, Biden term, which has been bad, is going to be taking to a whole new level, I think, in 2025, because, you know, that'll take us almost all the way to 2030. And again, my original point, 2030 is a real date in terms of, you know, what the U.S., at least the Democrats here, and what Europe, which is all on board for it, including the U.K., what they want to accomplish. So, you know, we need to take them at their word. And I do think as part of that, declaring a climate emergency will give you a lot more power, right? Saw that through COVID, which may have been a dry run. And I think that may happen in 2025. And if you look at the International Energy Agency and the UN, which are both, you know, scaremongers about climate, you know, they have talked about that too. They've been saying we need to stop funding new oil and gas investment the middle part of this decade in order to achieve our 2030 and 2050 goals, right? You know, and they've been saying that for the last few years. So, again, we need to take them at their word, and then we'll see. I mean, the LNG pause. I mean, I think they announced the LNG pause, hopefully to get more environmentalists on board, you know, for a second Biden term, right? But, you know, my guess is that if they win, that pause becomes a moratorium, right? Because if you read between the lines in the initial press release, they're all focused on climate, right? Looking at it, you know, full spectrum. If we're producing LNG over here, you know, we're not, you know, the argument that some in the industry here, like EQT, have made, is we need to use LNG to decarbonize other countries, right? The third world, get them off coal, use our LNG. That's never going to happen because, you know, climate change is all about a two-tiered system, right? So China, Indonesia, India, they do one thing, they stay on coal, and Europe and North America, we're the ones who have to decarbonize. We're the ones who have to deindustrialize, right? That creates a level playing field, but only by reducing the developed world and raising up the developing world. So we need to acknowledge that illogic, right? But, you know, the fact that they declared the pause, you know, there's no need to do that, right? I think it was to be showy, maybe give some Democrats the ability to run against that policy. You know, a few of them came out to the extent that there's still moderates left in the Democratic Party. But I think it gets more aggressive. And if you look at everything that they passed, you know, we're not leasing as much offshore. You know, we're restricting onshore leasing, right? We're going after the Permian in a big way, right? You know, so we may declare it and ozone non-attainment, which will constrict development, right?
Hmm.
We've used the Endangered Species Act, well, with two obscure species that are only indigenous to the Permian Basin. So that will also restrict it.
The dunes, sagebrush lizard.
And the prairie chicken, right? Exactly. Right?
Yeah, prairie chicken, yeah.
And then my favorite would be the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, approving the disposal of nuclear power plant waste on the New Mexico side of the Permian Basin, right? Even though we're tracking every well there, it's seismically, we know there's an issue, right, with some of the disposal wells, but it's a much different part of the country than it was 30 years ago when it was dormant and everyone couldn't wait to get out of West Texas, right? Now it's the hub, it's the most prolific oil and gas basin, and we're going to store nuclear waste there. I mean, call me crazy, but I think they're asking for, an accident, right? So all of that's been targeted against the industry, and then layer in ESG, right? Which the defunding will kick in more so. My personal guess is that a lot of European accounts starting next year will just basically say, we're not going to invest in oil and gas, equity, credit, what have you, going forward. And then we'll see how that spills over here.
Man, a lot to think about, that's for sure. Well, to wrap up then, Paul, it's been a great conversation. Thank you for doing this. Do you have any optimism to share with us? We've talked about a lot of negativity and there's a lot to be pessimistic about on this issue, but are there some things that you're optimistic about on this or on other things?
I'm optimistic about this. I mean, the book has, kind of an ominous title to it. I'm a firm believer that, unless you acknowledge you have a problem and the scope of it, you're never going to solve it, right? So, writing the book, putting it all in one place in easy terms to understand whether you're in the market or not, that was my first step. But, I'm very optimistic. And again, to finish your last question, the red states have to continue to lead the charge. We have to keep doing what we're doing in terms of challenging all these federal statutes because we know that the federal government is not able to. And the Republicans, they've had obviously a mixed record getting their act together. And who knows how the Congress is going to be split going forward. So it's really the red state attorney generals and the governors that have to continue to lead the charge. I think the fact that Chevron deference now has been, cast to the dustbin of history is good because it's a good precedent for all of these lawsuits, starting with the SEC climate disclosure rule. So I'm feeling optimistic about that. And then we just need to be creative about other ways, just like the other side has legally, to come up with ways. And one I'd throw out to you, Louisiana passed a new bill, which actually bans international treaties, the World Health Organization pandemic treaty, but also the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And I think you have to roll into that the Paris Agreement. So it's banned by municipalities and cities within Louisiana, right? And New Orleans is a member of the C40 cities, which is a group that was started by Bloomberg. And it's basically cities that align with the Paris Agreement for 2030, right? So they're cutting emissions. They're doing congestion pricing like up here in New York. Now that bans that. So if we challenge that, and I hope the other side will challenge it, I hope actually Texas and other red states replicate that law to the extent they control the legislature, and then one or more of them get challenged because all of these treaties, the Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, including the pandemic treaty, they weren't ratified by the Senate. So they're illegal, right? They should have been, not by executive order. And it's crazy that we have, states, blue or red, and cities within them and businesses within those states that are aligning with the United Nations on, very important economic policy, right? I mean, that's like aligning with Korea's last 5-year, plan, right? North Korea, right?
Right.
I mean, these economic treaties should have no impact on states, municipalities, or businesses, right? And I think all of that proceeds from the fact that, it was a legal process initially. So, whether we have to wait for the White House to be Republican controlled to resubmit that or a challenge to come from the red states, we need to do that. I think we also need to go after the endangerment finding, which was passed by the Obama EPA back in 2009. And it was conclusion driven, right? Carbon is a pollutant. Yeah. Even though the EPA, was never required to focus on carbon dioxide or any greenhouse gas as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And Congress got a a couple of tries at it with their amendments, and still they refuse to designate. And that makes sense because it's a naturally occurring greenhouse gas, right? Right. So how do you, it's like water vapor. I mean, you're going to regulate water vapor because that's a greenhouse gas too, right? So I think we need to be more aggressive and creative going after all of these regulations so that we can cut out the legs from all of it, right? So I am very optimistic, but it's going to take government resources, right? I think what individuals can do is just, again, educate yourself about climate change. Most people intuitively know that it's a crock. It's a sham. But we need to get more people, including lawmakers, who are not afraid to talk about it in public. I mean, the standard Republican line is, well, whenever climate change comes up, well, I'm all for clean air. Well, that's a non sequitur, right? Right? Yeah. That has nothing to do. Clean air and clean water has nothing to do with the climate change argument that carbon dioxide is killing the planet, right? And now we have to take that logic and start shutting down farms because they're releasing nitrous oxide. So you can see how extreme their argument is going and how, further ridiculous it is. So we need to pressure our lawmakers to get a backbone and speak out more publicly about this.
Yep. Amen. I agree. There's a lot we need to do here. A lot of government failures. That's what I talk a lot about on this show. And we don't need more of them. More government's not going to solve other government failures. We need to get government out of the way is the best way to let people prosper. And so, Paul, and for the audience, again, the book is The Race to Zero, How ESG Investing Will Crater the Global Financial System by Paul Tice. I'll be sure to put this in the show notes page. But Paul, thank you for being on Let People Prosper show and for all the work that you're doing. And God bless you and your family. Excellent, excellent. Well, for the audience, thank you for joining us today. Give us a 5-star rating. Share this with your friends and family so that they'll know more information about ESG and the nonsense that's going along with it and for them to prosper as well. Remember, you can find all this at vanceginn.com or my newsletter, vanceginn.substack.com. And until next time, let people prosper.